me here today. I'm a social and biological psychologist, so what that means is that I ask social kinds of questions, but I use biological responses to find the answer. So I'll typically start with a question: how does X get under the skin to affect health? And very similar to the director of the Greater Good Science Center, Rudy Mendoza-Denton, who started us off this morning by telling you his own journey of studying sort of the darker side of the human spirit. I too, for 10, 12 years, have been studying questions like, how does discrimination get under the skin to affect health? How does social disparities, anxiety, depression, psychopathology? But 2 years ago, I saw the announcement by the Greater Good Science Center, and one of the questions that they wanted to fund research projects was, how might gratitude affect health and well-being? And that wasn't typically the kind of question I asked, but I was intrigued and really challenged by the idea of, instead of looking at sort of the worst part of humanity and how that might impair health, can the opposite, which is a very different kind of question, can something positive be beneficial for health? And I thought this was a huge challenge, but I wanted to take it on. And so for today, I'm going to ask the question, how does gratitude get under the skin to affect health and longevity? And before you could get to the how question, you actually have to start with the does question. Does gratitude affect health and longevity in a very serious, scientific, biological, deep way? Is it just that grateful people are also less depressed and that's why they have better health? Are grateful people have better social connections and it's because of those social connections that are related to health? So we wanted to ask this in a very precise and focused way. Now, as a social psychologist, I'll typically rely on lab experiments. And the benefit of a lab experiment is you can control every feature of the environment. I could expose somebody to feel grateful versus a control condition, and then I can see how they change in their neuroendocrine responses, in their autonomic nervous system responses, in their behavior, and I've controlled every feature. But that's a very sort of sterile environment. It has lots of benefits, but lots of limitations too. So we could also ask, well, what about their daily lives? People might be very grateful at home with close others and their spouse and their children, but then they go to work and they're sort of big jerks, and they're not very grateful, or they're students and they don't appreciate their teachers. So looking at sort of social context that people live in can tell us a lot about how they might use gratitude in their daily experiences and how that might affect their health and biology. We also can ask about social relationships. Are you grateful for the people around you? Do you appreciate your social relationships? And we also are interested in looking at how something like gratitude can affect the thing that we do 1/3 of our lives, which is sleeping. So we ask all of these questions in a very broad research study. So we had 4 specific ideas that we wanted to test with a large sample of subjects. The first question was, what are the individual differences in gratitude? Right? We all have different levels of trait gratitude. How does that relate to health and longevity? Using very deep, sophisticated biological markers. Markers that are pre-disease. Right? So if you look at somebody who's already have cardiovascular disease, their system is already disrupted and tainted. It's harder to see what might lead them down a disease trajectory. So we're looking at pre-disease indicators, the neurobiological soup that we walk around in, right? Our cells and our hormones and our autonomic functioning. We're looking at individual differences and how it relates to that kind of biology. We also use experimental approaches where we manipulate gratitude in a laboratory, but also potentiate gratitude using a hormone called oxytocin. So you might have heard about oxytocin. We all have some people have more than others. We can take oxytocin and with an intranasal spray, deliver that neuropeptide directly to people's brains. And within about 30, 40 minutes, people who get oxytocin versus a placebo we'll start having more pro-social emotions, start trusting others. So that's our experimental approach. We also look at a field study. How do people respond in their daily lives? Measuring their autonomic nervous system responses and their hormones as it relates to gratitude. And then we try to put it all together to try to make a mosaic of what people who are high versus low in gratitude look like at a biological level. Now I'm going to tell you a secret. It's a dirty secret about scientists. And the dirty secret is that we all typically study one type of pathway or system. And it might not have anything to do with the actual question, but we become an expert on a particular pathway, and then we just keep digging into the ground on that particular pathway. But I didn't want to do that in this study, so what I did is I put together a team of scientists with varied expertise so I could ask from multiple pathways, how might gratitude influence health? An oxytocin pathway, a potentiated behavior, vagal pathway, stress reduction, all these different ways that might be health promoting. 4 interrelated studies, I just told you a little bit about them. Basically, the key factor is that we recruited a lot of people, we measured dispositionally their gratitude, looked at their self-reported subjective experience, their depression and anxiety. We brought a lot of them into the lab study where we gave half of them oxytocin versus placebo and looked how they responded to a moment of an experimental manipulation where somebody was kind to them, helped them out of a jam, and then looked at how that affected their physiological responses and their behavior. That is like an acute experience of gratitude. We took a blood draw where we isolated the cells from those individuals and then exposed those cells to various experiments that I'll tell you about. And then finally, we did a sleep study where we arrived at people's houses, put sensors on them right before they went to sleep, and then looked at how sort of experiences of gratitude affected sleep quality. So very sort of broad interrelated study. To do these kinds of studies, you put sensors on people and let them live their daily lives. So I'm going to give you just a few quick results from this study. It's still mostly ongoing and we're putting things together. Here's what we've learned so far. When people have higher levels of gratitude, they tend to have much better well-being, lower anxiety, higher optimism, lower neuroticism and depression. People with higher levels of gratitude are more socially connected. They're less likely to be rejection sensitive or to believe that social hierarchies are sort of a way to organize society. They're much more interested in sort of flat social connection. They're much less likely to be angry, and for those of you who truly practice gratitude often, your sleep quality tends to be better the more grateful you are, and your partner reports that your sleep quality is better. So the idea is that it can influence those around you. At a biological level, we find that people who are higher in gratitude have lower resting blood pressure. Then when we expose them to a stressor, they also respond with lower blood pressure responses. We looked at their blood screen where we screened for typical cardiometabolic profiles. So these are the risk factors that make you susceptible to cardiovascular disease. So good cholesterol, bad cholesterol. Higher levels of gratitude are related to higher good cholesterol, lower bad cholesterol, and lower levels of creatinine, which is an indicator of how functioning your kidneys are. So it gives you an indication of how much sort of metabolic waste is coming through. So the most exciting part of our data collection, though, with 1 minute left, I'll tell you about this very quickly. In our blood draw, we isolated the cells from individuals, and we looked at this particular type of cell that's been related to cardiovascular disease. They're called endothelial progenitor cells, and these cells help sort of restore the vascular endothelium. They're very powerful, they can regenerate. And people who've had heart disease, the lower your levels of these endothelial progenitor cells, the more likely you are to not survive 12 months. So the graph that I have up here shows your survival rates at very low levels of endothelial progenitor cells. So we took these progenitor cells from each of our subjects and exposed them to various studies. And what you see here is that for participants who reported something like better paternal care. So these are all adults, but remembering back on their childhood. And if they remember their childhood was characterized by better paternal care, more warmth, they had better migration of these cells. That's a good thing. So something that we remember back 30 years ago is related to how well our cells are functioning. At the time, though, we also asked about how anxious these individuals were, and higher levels of anxiety were related to worse cell functioning. They're both not moving, these cells aren't moving like they're supposed to, and they're not responsive to different reagents that we give to them. So these studies are sort of all ongoing, and of course our interest is looking at these relationships to something like gratitude, and how can gratitude both in the moment and then longitudinally be related to better health. And with that, as I mentioned before, I obviously have this huge team of scientists who I work with, and these are just some of those individuals, and I thank all of you for your time.